Hey guys, I'm back in the shop here, and I recently had a request from a YouTube member that had saw one of my videos using my Powermatic shaper setup for running cabinet door parts, and was looking for a little bit more information. So I thought I would try to actually create a little bit more of an in-depth video as far as a little bit more as far as how I arrived where I'm at. What I will tell you is there's going to be a lot of trial and error, because unless you're using the exact same cutter setup as I'm using here, it's not going to be quite exactly the same. What I can tell you is that as far as the sled height, let me actually show you here. Okay, as far as the actual sled height, it really depends on how tall your cutters are. These cutters are about 1 1/8 inches, and the way it's set up is, see if I can zoom in a little bit here. This top layer right here, minus this piece here, is above the bottom coping cutter. And basically, you have to have it taller. You can't have it shorter, because then the idea is that you can actually use these spacers here. This is just a standard spacer to basically raise this up, and then I use some precision shims that I talk about in the actual setup video. You use the shims basically to fine tune it. So basically what I did, let's see if I have a sample here. Here's a sample. I had set the height that I wanted on the face. I established that groove first, because then basically what it was is once I got the groove where I wanted, I had set up the tenon cutter to make sure it matched the same height. So that is the height, and these cutters are designed to run face down in a counterclockwise configuration. Once you have your profile depth established with the bottom cutter, the next step is to build your sled. Now in this case here, because of my cutter height, I was able to use 2 pieces of 3/4 inch standard cabinet grade plywood. And I would use cabinet grade plywood rather than something like a BC or a CDX or anything like that. I wouldn't use any building materials, because they're not quite as stable. You want something here that's going to be stable and flat. If I were to redo this, I'd probably make this out of aluminum. But anyways, this is just kind of a, I wouldn't say a budget build, but it's just something that I need to do for a job, and I've adapted it, and it works very, very well for as little as I use it. Anyways, so these are 2 pieces of 3/4 inch plywood, and what I've done here is I've added these laminate strips here. It's just a piece of high pressure laminate, and I've glued them onto the bottom. Now this is just something I had laying around. You could use anything really to basically just lift it up a little bit. And this is just a glide or a guiding surface. Then I have this Rockler miter bar slot, and then a couple more of these laminate strips here. And this is more so just for less friction on the face. So only these laminate strips come in contact with the table. So the idea here is to shim your cutter up, so that way when you put your piece in for coping, which is actually the first step, but you're actually setting it up backwards right now, is that they are the exact same height. Basically, I'm trying to remember how I did this. It's kind of harder to explain than what it was to do, but ideally you need to have this top cutter spaced and shimmed out, so that way when you put the tenons on, they'll automatically line up with the groove. When I switch over from coping to sticking or cutting the groove, I have no height adjustment. There's none whatsoever, because I got them shimmed out perfectly. The shimming also will depend on your actual true thickness. Plus I added the plastic laminate on the bottom. Plus I also added this sheet of probably some, looks to be some 80 grit sandpaper to keep it from slipping once it was clamped in place. The question was, well, how big is this base? you can make that base size any size you want. Grab my tape measure here. My base is about 14 inches. The reason I have a 14-inch base and I don't have something smaller is this setup here will give me a width of about 7 7/8 approximately, because a lot of times on a cabinet end I will make a bottom rail on the end of a cabinet where they might have what I call a raised panel end or a flat panel end. So it's basically it's a door that doesn't have a profile and it's actually the cabinet side, and it goes from top to bottom. And the bottom rail is typically approximately 7 inches. And the idea is when I cut my toe notch out, that the leftover remaining where the toe notch cuts into the bottom rail, it's the exact same width as the stiles. So just a personal touch. There's nothing saying you have to do that. So you can make this however wide you want. I wouldn't make it too narrow. Make it wide enough so that way you have some flexibility to do wider material. And also, if you get too narrow, it might not be quite as stable. So a little wider wouldn't hurt, but I've never had anything wider. The other feature I have on here is this little block right here. And this block is held in place with this little tiny toggle clamp. And what it is it's basically just a blow-up block that's replaceable. If I want to change profiles, all I do is release this clamp, cut the end off, put it back in place again, tight up against the this fence here, and clamp it in place. And when I clamp my first piece in and I push it through, it actually cut out its own profile, so you have like a zero clearance basically on the back side. Here's for a job I'm kind of working on right now. These are already done, but as you can see here, I've got them coped and sticked, and the way this works is I'm trying to do this one-handed. Okay, now this isn't holding right because I actually cut this down. It's actually for a drawer front, but it would typically be wider. But the idea is that this backer here keeps the back side here nice and clean. Now I make everything oversized. My stiles and rails are 1/16 oversized because of the way I build my doors. So if I had a little bit of a blowout here, it wouldn't be a bad deal, because after the doors are built, I put the outside profile on the shaper, and that takes away that extra 1/16 of an inch. So I always make my doors an 1/8 inch oversize. Now that's my personal preference, because that way I don't have to edge sand the doors. I just basically lightly hit them with the orbital, and they're good to go. Versus before, I used to run them on the shaper. I'd actually use a router, and it was more of a pain because I had to sand the saw curse out. But because I had the machinery to do it, it was easier for me to actually just set it up to make the doors oversize and profile them on the shaper. So yeah, I guess basically, getting back to this whole height thing, you got to make sure that your coping cutter, which is on the bottom, is below the surface, which the top is right here, below the surface of that. I'll use a pointer here. This here is the top of the sled. So this top of this cutter has to be below the surface right here. And then, like I said, now I had to set this up because I believe my cutter is 1 1/8 inches tall. I put this 1/4 inch spacer in here, and then you can't see it, but there's actually, you can see it. These thin ones here look like a spacer, but they're actually precision shims. If you don't have the shims, you'll have a little bit of what you see right here. This little fuzz right here. Now, I don't know why it's on this end, but it's not on this end, so I think it's just the way I had the piece clamped. But if you have it set up perfectly, if anything, you'll have a little bit of this fuzz on both sides. A little bit's okay. I mean, it's not the end of the world. It's just that it's more, if it's that much uneven, it's more that you have to try to even the joint out. I actually bring my doors to a small shop that has a wide belt time saver sander, and it's basically a great big wide belt, or great big belt sander that actually sand the entire surface of the door so everything's nice and even. So if you don't have that, and like I've done in the past, I did it with the previous video I launched here, the decorative trash can series. That was all done here in the shop, and I actually sanded all the joints, and I made sure that when I set the shaper up that I had this fuzz very minimized. The one other thing I want to point out, which is absolutely crucial, you want to make sure that you run your material all in the same direction as far as the same orientation. There's a lot of cutters out there that are from the Taiwanese, I don't know what company makes them, but there's like one company that makes a bunch of Taiwanese brazed tooling cutters for doing stiles and rails. And they'll have this cutter run this direction, face down. But then the other cutter, they'll have it tipped in the opposite direction. So in order to run it face down, you have to run the spindle the other way versus this way. So you have to run the spindle clockwise. These here, both of these cutters are designed to cut face down in the same direction. So basically what I'm getting at is there's some cutter manufacturers out there, usually it's the Taiwanese ones, that have the groove or the pattern cut face down in a counterclockwise configuration, and then they have the cope cut face up in a counterclockwise configuration. Anytime you have to orientate your material, you have much more room for variation. So the only other way around that is to actually make sure your stock is consistent in thickness, or if you have the ability to run everything in one direction, whether it's all face up or all face down, it'll be so much more easier. So just keep that in mind. So that's kind of basically it in a nutshell. I just put these two handles on here. These handles, there's no particular location. I actually have them pretty much right above the miter bar. I want to add a piece of plexiglass here at some time, so that way I don't have any risk of ever coming loose and getting my fingers in the cutters. Even though I'm holding on to these the whole time, I would still feel a bit better if there was a piece of plexiglass here, or actually Lexan, which I actually do have a piece. I just haven't actually gotten onto it yet. But this clamp, this is I think it's called a Good Hand. Well, there's the part number. It's is it a BH or a GH? GH20235. Let me see. Here we go. See if I can zoom in on that for you. Yes, it's called a Good Hand. I believe this has a strength of 750 pounds, or maybe it's 1,000 pounds. And I wasn't more so concerned about the strength as the long arm. And you can see how big this is. I mean, here's my hand, and I got a pretty good size hand. I got what you call a farmer's hand. I grew up on a dairy farm. You can see as far as the throw on this and just the overall size. The only thing that I did differently is this is not the original foot that came with. I found this adapter at rockler.com. And what's nice is when I run a wider, like a wide bottom rail, I can move this just as simple as that. So I can adjust this wherever I need it just by loosening this knob up. So that's a really, really good feature. If I didn't have it, just basically have a nut on the bottom like there is right here, and then a nut on the top. So you just need a wrench to loosen up, move it, and tighten it back up again. You could use a wing nut as well. So, but yeah. The one thing that I will tell you with this jig is squareness is key. You want to make sure that your jig is square to your miter slot, but most importantly, you want to make sure that your fence that you're referencing from is 90 degrees square to the miter slot, because that's how that is the key to making a square door, so it squares up almost virtually every time automatically when you're building doors, whether it's a flat panel, raised panel. As your joints are cut square, your door will cut square. Will square up when you clamp it. So even if your miter saw is off, the way I have this set up, as you can see here, there's a tiny little gap. That gap is about a 32nd of an inch. Reason being is I make my rails 1/16 longer than normal, and when I push it up against here, this is my referencing point, I push it up against here, clamp it down, push it through, and when I pull it back, it's actually 30 seconds shorter. I flip it around, do the same thing. So I always make my rails a 1/16 longer. So that's the nice thing about that way. If your saw is slightly off, your miter saw or your sled or whichever you're using to cut your stiles and rails, if it's slightly off, it automatically gets squared up on this jig here. Now what I did find was at one time this jig was perfectly square, but something might have moved or something might have changed. So what I ended up doing was I just added a piece of paper here to move it away. You see there's probably about a 15 thousandths gap here or so. That was to basically, when I was coping it and I was checking with a square, it was off ever so slightly. So this was the quick fix. Ideally, if I were to do this again, I would remove these screws, and I could still do it yet, and add a couple more of these bolts here and elongate the holes, so that way I can make this whole fence assembly pivot or move for adjustment. So, but then again, if I were to redo this, I would definitely do it in probably aluminum, just for longevity. So yeah, I'm sorry I don't have an actual dimension as far as how to determine how you get your height here. Basically what you could do is once you determine the height of your profile, and once you've stacked your cutters with like a standard shim, you could just cut a couple scrap pieces and then manually line up your groove. And I think that's actually what I did, is manually line up this piece here. So let me grab a couple scrap pieces here. Okay, I just got a couple pieces of scrap here to reference a rough height of the sled. So what I've done is made sure that I have the height of the profile that I want. I want to make sure that this is what I want to see when I machine my parts. This is the thickness I want in the front. Because I'm running face down, your back is going to vary, but your front will always be the same. Anyways, so once I've got this set up, I just can use a scrap here to get you in the ballpark. Now, if you were to look at this, you can see that they don't quite line up, and that's where your precision shims come in. The precision shims, I will tell you, they're not cheap, but they're not expensive. I'm going to say that you're probably going to spend probably between $20 and $40 for a package of shims to fit your spindle, and you're only going to use a portion of them, but they're precision, and that's kind of the price you're going to pay for a precision setup. So in this case here, as you saw, I've got a thicker one, and then there's some thinner ones that you can't see real well. There you go. So this fat one here, or this thick one, is a 1/4 inch, just a regular spindle spacer, and then this little thinner one here is actually a precision shim, and you can't see it too well, but there's actually some other shims in there, and these shims typically range probably in, I think, anywhere from 1 to 4 thousandths in thickness, so you can get whatever you need, but typically you could buy them in a package. If not, just buy yourself a handful. I think McMaster Carr sells this type of a shim I sell them by the piece. They might be a couple dollars a piece, but you might end up buying $20 worth. But the nice thing is you can stack them in any configuration to make sure you get your right height. So, as you can see here, that this cutter is too high, but if you lower the cutter, you will now lower your profile. So when you go back to set up, this height will be wrong. Okay, as you can see here, these don't quite line up, and part of the reason is because I've already got this shimmed out. But if I were to take these shims out here, this would drop down pretty close, but I would still need to add a shim or two to be able to raise this cutter up. If I took all the shims out right now, this here would be below the groove, which would be a good thing, because then I can actually add the shims to bring this cutter up in perfect height. So that is going to be the part that's going to be trial and error, and definitely don't think you're going to get it done in 5 minutes. It's going to take you some time. This whole setup I did here took a whole weekend to kind of work out the bugs, but I did get it. So yeah, that would be the easiest way to determine your actual sled height. So, and then also you want to verify and make sure that your fence is as square as possible to the miter slot. I would say to the edge of the table, but the miter slot is more predictable because they actually mill this versus your edge has just been forged. So your edge, like mine here, has a little bit of waviness to it. So if you don't always measure in the same spot, you don't know if it will always be square. So I always reference from the miter slot because that's actually where the jig is referencing from. There is a different way that you can reference this without the miter slot, but I don't really want to get into that because that could come into a patent issue. There is another system out there that uses a similar setup to this, but actually references off of a guide on top. But like I said, that I don't want to get into that because that could be a patent issue, and I know the owner of that company very, very well, and he's always treated me right, and I do not want to get into that. So this is the system that I came up with. With that being said, the one thing I will tell you that I recently did here is I tore the shaper down here for running a shaker set, and what happened was the cutter diameters are slightly different, but they're both the same. When I set it back up again, I could never get the tongue to clear this fence. So what I did was I cut a real shallow dado in here, so when I come through, the tongue is not coming close to this fence. And that's something you might end up figuring out as you guys build your own, or whoever wants to build their own, is that it won't hurt to cut a shallow rabbet here. You know, it doesn't have to be very deep. This one's only probably about a 1/16 deep, just so that way when you're milling your tongue, and as your piece comes forward like this here, it doesn't butt into the fence itself. Okay, let's talk about the fence, auxiliary fence. Okay, here is the auxiliary fence. I just used the piece of ash, and that's actually not the best wood. I need to really redo this, and I think I'm going to do it with a piece of aluminum, I think. What I found is that when I made this about a year ago, that obviously over the climate changes, this always changed. And I think if I would have maybe taken the time to seal and lacquer it, it probably would have helped it. But what happened is it grew, and all of a sudden my members are getting narrower. The frame parts are narrower than what they're supposed to be. So anyways, on the back side here, I just have a Rockler miter T-track, which is basically just the reason I bought it is because it was long and it fits perfectly into the miter slot. It's actually really snug and it won't really move. So I used to use these clamps that fit into the T-track. They can actually fit underneath here, and you tighten it up and it would hold it. But what I found is that they don't actually move, so I don't even use those anymore. Somebody had asked me, the question was, well, how do you know how wide you need to make this? Well, the key is I have this set up so that these make the stiles and rails the size I want. So it really is all dependent on how wide you want your finished piece to be. So what I would do if I was you is I would get yourself the miter slot track and lay it in here, and then measure and make sure that you get a dimension here that's really close to what you want, and then make sure it's even from the fence, because make sure your fence is obviously going to be even with the miter slot, and then measure from end to end to make sure it's consistently even, and then temporary clamp it with just a couple clamps and run a couple test pieces. As far as the feeder setup, you need to do this with the power feed. It won't work any other way. Be really dangerous. You want to make sure that the power feed is angled this way. You want to make sure it's pushing against this fence, not this fence. And that's kind of the key to the whole system. Clamp your fence in place, set your power feed up, and run a test piece. And keep adjusting this on both sides to make sure that you get your final width you want. Once you've got that, then you can actually let's see if I can see, I've got a screw there. You can actually drill and drill anywhere actually, and put a screw in there to secure that end, and do the same thing on the other end. Now you have this fence secured on two ends in the position that you want. Now, especially if you've made this fence wider, you can use it for one width here, and then later on down the road, say you need to make some narrower styles, well then you can trim this side to whatever width you want. You just basically take the whole fence assembly and trim off the other side that you want. But the one thing I did do that I found to be a real good key, and unfortunately I can't use it right now because the like I said, the ash had expanded a little bit, is cut yourself a little rabbet in here. And what this does is it keeps chips from building up against a solid edge, so that way your stiles and rails will always be against the entire fence, versus like this here without the rabbet in there. Always run a risk of having a chip up against here, and then the piece could actually move. Your frame member could move. So this really is all dependent on your miter slot location, this location from here to the spindle, and then also how wide you want your stiles and rails. Now I had this set up to run two different widths. The one was my standard width, which is 2 7/16, and the other one was 2 15/16. And the reason behind that was, I'm sorry, 2.5 and 3 inches. The idea behind that is that when I do like a Lazy Susan corner door, I need the one stile 3/4 of an inch wider, so it's so much easier to just take this, flip it around, and run the wider pieces. So hopefully that answers a lot of your questions. If you guys still have questions, don't be afraid to send me a personal message, and I'll do my darndest to try and explain it. This is one of those things that I just kind of knew what I was looking for as I was doing it. I was trying to plan a little bit and kind of thinking my way through it, and like I said, it's something I did over a weekend, so it took some time. But don't get discouraged, because once you know some of the key things as far as the position of your cutter you want, and then your cutter height, and getting some precision shims and a couple spacers, you can actually get these spaced out perfectly. So yeah, so but what I would advise though is, if you guys make this auxiliary fence, if you do make it out of wood, take the time to seal and lacquer it, or polyurethane, whatever you want to use for a finish, so that way it'll keep it from minimizing from expanding and contracting. If you really want to get fancy, you might want to use something like an HD, a high density polyethylene, material, or some type of a plastic material used for making jigs. You know, if you do that, you'll spend a few dollars, or you can get really crafty and make it out of some aluminum channel stock, or just a piece of solid aluminum. You might pay $50 for that piece of aluminum, but you know, it might be worth it. The only disadvantage of this system is you're limited to 2 sizes basically with one setup. The problem I have is when I want to run a wide bottom rail, I can't even use this because this isn't wide enough for like my 7-inch wide bottom. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Here's a couple examples. This is what I call a raised panel end, and this is actually for a diagonal base cabinet. So the face here is going to come at a 45 this way, and oops, I'm sorry, this is actually a wall cabinet. Here's a diagonal. I got the top rail here. I always make the top rails on the base cabinets a little bit wider, because sometimes they like to put an outlet in here. And then here is that 7-inch bottom rail. So also on the wall cabinets, this is the bottom, And here is the top. I make the top rail 1.5 inches wider, like I do also on the face frames, to allow for applying of the crown molding. So, all right. Hopefully that answers a lot of your questions, and I'm trying to kind of keep it short because I could really go on and on for hours on this. Well, not hours, but I could go on for a while. But like I said, something that's really hard to kind of explain. It's something that hopefully with the tips that I've given you and ideas that you guys can actually kind of figure it out. And I don't mean to say figure it out like there, but be able to kind of fill in the fine point blanks. Like I said, it's something that took me a little while to figure out, and it took me a little time. Like I said, I think I did the whole system in about a weekend, and I still need to do a couple improvements, but the basic idea and information I've given you will hopefully give you the information you need to know as far as how to set up your own. So, plus I do have another video previous to this one that is specifically on this shaper setup. It gives you a little bit more information as far as how the system works and where you can find like the shims and the spacers and stuff like that. So anyways, I hope you guys found this video useful. Questions or positive comments are welcome. If you can't fit in the YouTube comment box, go ahead and send me a message, a private message, and I will do my best to answer it for you. Other than that, be safe, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.